The question was clear and straightforward, the kind that cuts through political showmanship and reaches the core of leadership accountability. Senator Chuck Schumer, seated across from FBI Director Cash Patel in a crowded Senate hearing room, had been waiting for this exact moment. The Jeffrey Epstein files, perhaps the most explosive criminal investigation in recent memory, were at the center of national attention. And the man leading that investigation was about to make a revelation no one expected. Director, when you first came across Donald Trump's name in the Epstein files, did you close them or keep reading? It should have been a simple question. A competent law enforcement chief should know every detail of the most significant case under his command. Yet Patel's answer revealed a level of carelessness that stunned even seasoned Washington observers. I have reviewed, not the entirety of the files, he began before Schumer cut him off. The unfinished sentence hung in the air, heavy and incriminating. The nation's top investigator overseeing the largest sex trafficking case in American history had just admitted he hadn't done a full review. You haven't gone through all the Epstein files? Schumer pressed. Personally, no. 2 words, personally, no. The head of the FBI, the agency responsible for protecting children from predators and pursuing justice in one of the most notorious sex trafficking networks in modern times, confessed he hadn't personally reviewed the full case. The admission sent a wave of disbelief through the hearing room. Schumer leaned forward, his voice carrying both authority and outrage. You're the director of the FBI. This is the largest trafficking case your bureau has ever handled. The buck stops at the top, and your testimony today is that you haven't read all the files. That phrase, the buck stops at the top, echoed across the chamber, invoking Harry Truman's timeless principle of accountability. In that moment, it applied squarely to Patel, who had just admitted to failing his most fundamental duty. Patel's next response made things worse. Instead of addressing the oversight, he shifted into self-congratulation. What I've been doing, he said, is ensuring this country's safety at historic speed, providing resources to reduce homicide, drug trafficking, and child trafficking. It was a classic deflection. Confronted with a specific question about his failure to review critical files, Patel launched into a public relations speech about general FBI achievements. The response felt tone-deaf and detached. He was using vague crime statistics to defend ignoring the very case that had shaken global institutions and implicated some of society's most powerful figures. Schumer didn't let it slide. I'm sure those children being trafficked would appreciate the director actually reading the files. The remark landed with quiet precision. Patel's contradiction was clear. He claimed success in fighting trafficking, but hadn't reviewed the most consequential trafficking investigation of his career. Schumer pressed further. You've said you don't know how many times Trump's name appears in those files. Could it be 1,000 times? The question was a trap, built from Patel's own admissions. If he hadn't read the files, how could he possibly know? How could he make decisions on investigations or prosecutions without understanding what was in them? Patel's answer only deepened the confusion. The number is totally misleading. We haven't released anyone's name from the Epstein files. That hasn't been credible. The statement was incoherent. First, he argued that the frequency of a name in investigative files was irrelevant, a claim any prosecutor would dismiss instantly. Second, he confused the idea of publicly releasing names with internally reviewing them. Whether or not names had been released to the public had nothing to do with his responsibility to know what was in his own files. Schumer pressed again. Director, you could have released every piece of information that was legally permissible. You can characterize the numbers however you want. But Patel was done. Cornered by contradictions he couldn't defend, he moved to shut the exchange down. Claiming my time, he said, a procedural tactic to silence further questioning. The damage, however, was complete. In just a few minutes, Schumer had exposed a failure that reshaped public perception of FBI leadership under Patel. The implications were massive. The Epstein case wasn't routine. It had uncovered an international web of powerful individuals exploiting minors. The files contained evidence that led to arrests, prosecutions, and ongoing investigations. They held intelligence with potential national security, diplomatic, and institutional consequences. And the man responsible for managing it admitted he hadn't read it all. Patel's negligence wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal for the victims whose stories were buried in those files. Every page he ignored represented someone who had suffered. Every unexamined connection meant justice delayed. Every name unread was either a victim needing protection or a perpetrator who had escaped accountability. As silence filled the hearing room, the reality of what had just been admitted sank in. This wasn't political theater. It was a serious question of competence. The FBI director's job isn't ceremonial. It cannot be delegated entirely to subordinates, especially in cases involving the exploitation of children and global criminal networks. The Epstein files weren't ordinary documents. They shaped investigations, diplomatic relations, and national security assessments. For Patel to admit he hadn't reviewed them personally wasn't a minor lapse. It was a failure of leadership that called his fitness for office into question. The exchange also revealed Patel's misunderstanding of accountability. Instead of owning up to the oversight, he defaulted to political talking points about agency accomplishments. It was the reaction of a politician, not an investigator. It showed a leader more focused on optics than on investigative rigor. His deflection was especially misplaced given the subject matter. Child trafficking isn't political, it's a matter of human decency. When Schumer remarked that the trafficked children would expect their FBI director to review the files, it wasn't partisan rhetoric. It was a moral truth. Patel's inability to grasp that distinction spoke volumes. Technically, his defense was equally troubling. Dismissing the frequency of names as irrelevant revealed either a misunderstanding of investigative analysis or a deliberate attempt to downplay uncomfortable information. Any skilled investigator knows that repeated names and connections often expose networks crucial to building strong cases. The global impact was undeniable. The Epstein case had international links, and foreign intelligence agencies were closely watching America's handling of it. For the FBI director to admit ignorance of his own files sent a troubling signal about U.S. seriousness and credibility abroad. Congressional oversight added another layer. Lawmakers like Schumer had a constitutional duty to ensure that federal agencies were functioning effectively. Discovering that the FBI's top official had neglected such a critical case demanded exposure and accountability. Patel's attempt to cut off questioning demonstrated not just defensiveness, but a lack of respect for congressional authority. The exchange also raised broader questions about executive competence under the Trump administration. If the FBI director hadn't fully reviewed his most significant case, what did that imply about leadership across other agencies? What did it reveal about the administration's standards for responsibility and public service? In the end, the victims of trafficking and the American people deserved far better. The FBI as an institution deserved better, and the principle of accountable governance demanded better. Senator Schumer's questioning revealed all of this in just a few minutes of calm, direct inquiry. Using Patel's own words, he had exposed a level of negligence that would be unacceptable in any law enforcement setting, let alone at the top of federal investigation. The buck stops at the top principle Schumer invoked wasn't a slogan. It was a cornerstone of effective leadership. When leaders accept responsibility, they establish accountability throughout their organizations. When they evade and deflect, they weaken the very system they're meant to uphold. Patel's performance made it clear he was more interested in sidestepping responsibility than embracing it. His first instinct was to change the topic rather than confront legitimate oversight questions. That strategy might work in politics, but it fails completely in law enforcement leadership. The American public was watching. The victims of trafficking were watching. Foreign partners and adversaries were watching. And what they saw was an FBI director admitting he hadn't studied the most critical case under his authority. The buck stops at the top, and at the top, Cash Patel had just acknowledged he wasn't fulfilling his role. The consequences of this admission went far beyond one embarrassing hearing. It exposed deeper issues within FBI management under Patel, sparking repercussions across the Bureau. Within hours, field offices around the country were buzzing with concern. Career agents who had spent years developing anti-trafficking expertise were stunned. How could they maintain credibility with local partners when their own director admitted ignorance of the Bureau's defining case? Morale plummeted. FBI agents take pride in their thoroughness and deep understanding of cases. Seeing their director fall short of those basic standards was devastating. Field supervisors began receiving uneasy calls from local police chiefs who had seen the hearing. If your director hasn't read the Epstein files, how can we trust FBI intelligence? Became a recurring question. Decades of credibility had been undermined in a matter of minutes. The international impact was equally damaging. Foreign intelligence services that had long cooperated on trafficking cases began questioning America's seriousness. The Epstein investigation had cross-border implications. International partners needed assurance that the FBI treated it with the gravity it deserved. The legal community was equally shocked. Federal prosecutors who had worked trafficking cases knew success required deep familiarity with every document, evidence logs, witness statements, and investigative patterns. The idea that the nation's top law enforcement official could oversee such cases without reviewing the files was incomprehensible. Victims' rights advocates felt betrayed. Groups that had fought for thorough investigations viewed Patel's comments as dismissive of their clients' suffering. Every page in those files represents real trauma experienced by real people, said the director of one major anti-trafficking organization. For the person leading the investigation to admit he hasn't read them isn't just professional negligence, it's a moral failure. The political fallout came swiftly and from both parties. Republican senators who once supported Patel's nomination struggled to defend his statements, while Democrats saw the moment as confirmation of their earlier warnings about his qualifications. Media coverage was intense. Editorial boards across the political spectrum condemned Patel's remarks, with conservative outlets being particularly unforgiving. The Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote sharply about the need for competence and accountability in federal law enforcement. Former FBI directors from both political parties broke their usual silence to issue rare public criticism. The director of the FBI must be the most informed person in the building about major cases, one former official stated. If you don't know what's in the files, you can't make the decisions those cases demand. The institutional damage went beyond the Bureau. Other agencies that relied on FBI coordination, like the DEA and Homeland Security, worried about the reliability of intelligence sharing. The Bureau's once golden reputation for professional rigor now seemed compromised, and that perception threatened recruitment as well. The FBI had always drawn the nation's best candidates, inspired by its legacy of precision and integrity. Patel's performance sent a troubling signal that such standards might no longer apply at the highest levels. Congressional oversight implications were profound. Schumer's questioning demonstrated that essential checks on executive power were being neglected. His example served as a warning to other officials who could no longer assume partisan loyalty would protect them from scrutiny. The long-term consequences for federal law enforcement were serious. The Bureau's effectiveness rests on public trust, professional excellence, and international cooperation. Patel's admissions had damaged all three pillars at once. Schumer's simple question had laid bare a negligence that raised doubts about the entire framework of FBI leadership. The buck stops at the top, and in this case, accountability had failed to reach it. The effects of this exchange would ripple through American law enforcement for years. The Epstein files were not ordinary documents. They represented one of the most complex and sensitive investigations in Bureau history, touching global networks, powerful individuals, and victims whose lives had been shattered. For Patel to casually admit he hadn't reviewed them all revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of his duties. The position of FBI director isn't ceremonial. It cannot be delegated away. True leadership in such a role requires personal engagement, especially with cases that shape national security, foreign relations, and institutional credibility. The investigative techniques Patel dismissed as misleading factors were in fact the backbone of criminal prosecution. Patterns of repetition, how often a name appears, who interacts with whom, reveal the structure of criminal networks. Dismissing such evidence suggested either ignorance of investigative practice or an effort to downplay politically sensitive information. The victims whose stories were buried in those files deserved better. Each document represented real pain and lost years of life. For the Bureau's leader to admit indifference to those accounts wasn't just a lapse in professionalism. It was a betrayal of the Bureau's moral obligation. The international consequences extended beyond policing. They touched diplomacy and America's standing in the world. Allies who had shared intelligence with the FBI began questioning whether the U.S. could still be trusted as a serious partner. Why share sensitive data with an agency whose leader treated his own most important investigation so lightly? Repairing that trust would take years and enormous effort. The damage reached into global intelligence networks and diplomatic relationships that had taken generations to build. The precedent set by Patel's behavior was equally alarming. If the FBI director could neglect such a core responsibility without consequences, what message did that send to other agency heads? Would they too conclude that accountability was optional? Schumer's line of questioning underscored why congressional oversight remains essential even in a polarized era. His persistence proved that informed, fact-based inquiry can still hold powerful officials to account, if lawmakers are willing to demand real answers. The exchange also highlighted the value of institutional expertise within law enforcement. The career agents who built the Epstein case understood its complexity and significance. Their years of dedication couldn't be replaced by political appointees uninterested in the work. When leadership ignores such expertise, it doesn't just harm one case, it weakens the entire foundation of federal law enforcement. But the greatest damage was to public trust. Americans had watched in real time as their FBI director confessed that he hadn't done the most basic preparation for oversight of a defining investigation. That admission would linger in public consciousness long after the hearing ended. Rebuilding faith in the Bureau would require years of consistent, transparent leadership. Media coverage ensured Patel's words would echo far beyond that hearing room. Clips, headlines, and editorials would replay the moment endlessly. In the digital era, such moments of exposed incompetence become permanent records, etched into history and impossible to erase. The lesson for future leaders was unmistakable. Preparation matters. Competence matters. Accountability matters. Deflection cannot substitute for integrity. Schumer had shown that a single senator, armed with facts and persistence, could cut through political fog and reveal the truth. The victims, the agents, America's allies, and the American people themselves all deserved leadership that honored its responsibilities. Patel's performance had failed that standard, and its effects would reverberate throughout the law enforcement community for years. In the end, two words defined the entire exchange. Personally, no mieux. Those words became the symbol of an approach to public service that valued political safety over professional duty. The buck stops at the top, and sometimes it exposes that the person at the top simply isn't doing the job.